For this video, which is going to be a few different sections, will be about creating your first level. In this case, with the first one, we're going to create the level, we're going to create the terrain, we're going to paint the terrain, and then we're going to apply vegetation, all within this one video. So it should only take about 10 minutes, and let's get to it. To start, we'll go to File, New, and we'll call this one training_first LVL. And we'll keep it in the levels folder, and we're going to choose a small height map resolution, which means the terrain size will be 128 meters in all directions. We're going to keep the texture dimensions at 4K and not worry about the other settings because they have to do with compression and are out of the scope of this video. We're going to click OK. And now we basically have our level, which is 128. And if we come down here, we have our ocean. So what we need to do is we need to define the height of this terrain so it matches the height of the ocean. Let's go into Edit, Set Terrain, inside of the Terrain Editor box. And we're going to go to setting the terrain to something about 50 meters high. We'll notice that nothing happened, and this is because we need to actually generate the terrain again. So let's bring the feature size down to about 3.6 is fine. We can lower the bumpiness all the way, and everything else we'll keep at basic. So if I click OK, we now have a nice little terrain. I think I can actually get something a little bit better, so you can always go back and generate more over and over again if you want to see the variation that you can create. So let's go ahead and see what we can get again. So we keep getting blobs and blobs. Eventually one of them will be about what I'm looking for. And this will do. I kind of just wanted more than just one and kind of relatively small. So now we have our ocean and we have our island, because that's what we're going to do is create a desert island. It's the easiest thing that you can do with the most aesthetically pleasing results quickly. What I need to do now is get rid of some of these humps. They're just too big. So inside of the terrain editor, I can go to Sculpt, and I'm going to choose Flatten. And if I were to just start painting, it would be kind of random, and that's not what we want. What I'm going to do is lower this down to 10 on the radius, and you'll see down here in the height, we can actually have the option to pick. And what we're actually going to do is pick it dynamically by holding down the control key. So if we keep our eyes peeled on this and we click down here on the edge, maybe right there, we can see that it's switching based on where we click. So let's keep it at about 18.6. And what we can do now is we can come in here and know that wherever we sculpt, it's not going to be below that level. So we can keep that, maybe do something over here. But now what if we want to actually smooth this out? So if we can press the Shift key, we now have the ability to smooth it out on everything that we just sculpted. So maybe we want to smooth everything down so we can kind of have something that's a little bit better flattened. That way we have a better beach. So now that we have basically our landmass declared, we need to create a terrain texture to cover it, because right now the checkerboard look just isn't working. So if we go to Paint and I right click and create a layer, let's call this one Sand Dry, and we're going to choose the texture to be Textures, Defaults, and we're just going to choose white because we want to paint the actual texture of sand. So we need to choose the material now. And what we're going to do is go to Materials, Terrain, and choose Beach White Sand. And what we can do is we can paint this in if we want. So if we start painting, you'll notice right away we get a lot of sand everywhere, and we can actually even change the color of it. Let's drop it down in just grayscale, and you'll notice it's darker. So maybe that's what we want. And this doesn't look bad, actually. So instead of painting everything, we can actually cheat. We can right-click this layer and say Flood the layer. And then automatically we have sand everywhere, which works pretty well. The one thing that I don't have is I want to have a a wet sand. It doesn't look exactly right when we see some shadowing, but we don't see any change in how the sand kind of washes away. So what we can do is create another layer and call this one sand wet. And we can change the texture again to be the textures defaults white again. And then this time we're going to choose a different material. So we go to Materials, Terrain, and choose Beach White Sand Wet. We can go ahead and start painting this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint it in just so we can see what we have. It's a little bright, so if I can Control Z back, let's drop it like we did the other, and that'll work. So all I did was calibrate it because we're actually going to do a constraint and procedurally paint it. Like before with the sculpt, we can go back and we can flatten, but the key thing to understand is we're actually going to pick the height of how far it influences. So the water's here. Let's say we influence up to this point here. So let's try 16.5. So going back to sand wet, we can set the minimum height or the maximum height. Let's go ahead and put this to 16.5 and the max height, and we'll leave the min height at 0. So if I right-click this now and flood the layer, you'll notice that it's painted it all around the edge of the actual ocean. Or, I mean, you couldn't get it any better because we're able to paint whatever we want along the edges and not have to worry about whether or not it works because we've procedurally generated it based on a height. So now that we've done that, we're ready to go in and create some vegetation like we said. So this right here is going to require us to go to Tools, and we'll go to the Vegetation Editor, and let's snap this over the other editors. So I'm going to bring this out a little bit. We're going to create some groups. The first group I'm going to do is I'm going to add the Trees group. This is going to be the easiest one to do, and probably the most densely populated one. And then we're going to do another group called Bushes, and that'll be the lower. So if we go into this Trees, we're going to actually click up here. These are the same icons that we had before, and we can click and add the actual trees we want. So what I want is I want to have a palm tree, and I'm going to select all of the palm trees in this group. And if I scroll this open, we can see all of them, and you would have the same selections on all of the trees, but this time I'm actually going to select the group, and you can influence all of the children of the parent group. I'm going to change the size variation to be about 0.7 past the size. We're going to do a random rotation, and then in the bending, we're just going to set that to 1. We're going to come down to the density, and we're going to change this to about 7 or so. Keep in mind, this is the density between the actual instances. So the lower the actual level, it's counterintuitive. You would think, okay, density, I want it to be closer together. So what would I do? I want to create more objects, and you would increase it. But the density actually relies on the distance between those. So the higher the value, the actually more spacing you get. We're going to come in here as well and change this to 18 on the elevation minimum. And then we're also going to change the cast shadow and the receive shadow, and we'll keep the min spec set to low. So let's save this real quick, and then what we're going to do is right-click and distribute the selected vegetation objects and see what we get. So now we have a lot of trees all over the place that we just randomly generated, and to be honest, it doesn't look that bad. It's kind of a little bit too much. So maybe I want to go back and change it. Well, there are different options that you can have here. We can set our trees, and we can click the erase button, and we can start erasing them manually, which works quite well. It doesn't matter if they were procedurally generated. We can come in and change that all around. You can also have the option to maybe hide certain species. So maybe that's what we want. We could do this, maybe hide that. And this looks a little bit more manageable as far as what the island is doing. So we have all of these trees in place, and we have these other trees that maybe we can just completely get rid of if we wanted. So we go down to remove. So now we don't deal with them at all. So let's look at this again. What if we want to just change this and distribute some more? So we can distribute more objects. And this is the nice idea of being able to use like procedurally or dynamically changeable amounts just based on by clicking a button instead of going in and painting. And like I said before, we can go in, we can paint the objects as well. So the question is, what exactly do you want in your trees, and how exactly do you want them to be dynamically pushed around? We're going to go back, and we're actually going to do bushes now. So I'm going to add some bushes, natural bushes, and we're going to choose green fern bush. We're going to select all of these, and we're going to do some of the similar things that we did on the others. 0.7, the rotation, we're going to set the bending to 1. We'll go ahead and move down. Let's set the elevation minimum to 18. Cast shadow and receive shadow. And then for the most part, I think we'll be set to go ahead and distribute. So the one thing that I realized that I didn't set right before I clicked this was I didn't set the density. So you can see how much it actually matters. With a density that's not declared, we now have bushes everywhere, which may be what you wanted, but it's not what we wanted. So pressing Ctrl Z, I can come down into the bushes, and I can set the density to something a little bit more manageable. So let's do that to 6 and see what gets laid down. So now we can see that we have quite a few more bushes, but maybe we want to keep adding to them. So we have all these objects that we would be able to use. And now going into select, I can actually come in and change these too. So it's just a feature like the paint and remove that you would be able to select the objects that you're wanting to change and being able to change them dynamically. So if I want all of these objects to be able to scale down, we have the option to do so. And like before, we can also go in, shrink this down, and maybe remove some species. So you never know exactly what you want from something. Maybe you want a lot of bushes, or maybe you don't. We can go in and we can erase objects, which we're going to do in this case. And we're going to set something up so we can have like a little bridge in the later stages of this. But for right now, we have the vegetation. We have just laid it. And I think I'm going to end the video there just before we start getting into the actual global illumination and setting the clouds up, and then sticking an object right here and maybe a nice little dock that we could have out into the ocean. So this is at least showing you how to set up the vegetation, how to set up everything dynamically and change around the actual parameters on the fly quickly, which is the most important part.